We have a special program tonight. I'm Stu Wallace. I'm a history professor here and a member of the Wings of Knowledge Committee. Wings of Knowledge has programs every month on a variety of subjects, such a variety of subjects I can't even tell you all of those subjects, but they tend to relate to what we're teaching here or to something that's going on here, or frankly anything else of interest. Tonight's presentation is going to be a lot of fun because we are fortunate to have from down below Ken Gloss, who is the owner, longtime owner, and before that worker in the Brattle Street bookstore, which isn't on Brattle Street, by the way, because Brattle Street isn't there anymore, sorry. But he has been there, he was saying full-time since '73, and before that, it was your father's, I guess it was his store. So he tends to know books, lots about books and mysteries of books. I was very fortunate many years ago. I was director at New Hampshire Historical Society, and I spent a lot of my time with antiquarian book dealers who were in there appraising books. And I had a tendency to poo-poo their work and say, yeah, you know, they don't know what they're doing. Oh, okay, sorry. I had a tendency, right, that way, okay. I had a tendency to poo-poo their work and think it wasn't worth anything. And one day a dealer pulled me over as he was appraising books, and he handed me one of those 19th century long-winded speeches that writers would write, and they would hand out, make 100 copies and give to their friends at Christmas, and nobody wanted them. And he handed me a big, fat speech, and he said, "What do you think it's worth?" And I realized what it was at first. It was Edward Everett's speech at Gettysburg, that long-winded story. You know, we always know that Gettysburg story. And I thought, yuck. And I looked at about 4 pages, and I said, well, that's very nice. I'm not interested in this. And he said, keep looking. And so I looked some more, and I realized how long-winded the speech was. It must have lasted longer than the battle. And I kept looking and looking and looking, and I was ready to stop, and he said, keep looking. And I looked at the last page, and it just said, and he probably had this thing published almost the minute he gave his speech. The last page simply said, "Some remarks by President Lincoln." And for all we know, that was the first publication of the Gettysburg Address. And so much more interesting than the rest of his speech. So then I began to like book people after I realized they were pretty good at this stuff. Ken is the authority. Many of you may have seen him on Antiques Roadshow. And the way we're going to do this tonight, I'll turn it over to Ken. He'll have a formal program, open it up to some Q&A. If you have questions, I'd appreciate it if you would let me get to you with the microphone, but he will also repeat the questions. And then after this more formal presentation, he'll allow folks to bring a few books up to have him take a look at them. I noticed some of you brought your books in. That's good. This is good. So I'd also like for you to sign an attendance sheet. We have a tendency to want to know who's coming to our programs. Don't worry, you won't get junk mail from us. So I appreciate this very much. And without further ado, I'll turn this over to Ken.
Thank you. What I do in a talk, the talk will last 45 minutes to an hour. First half hour, I'll talk about what is an old book, first editions. I'll give a little bit more of my background history, show off a few of the things that I brought, tell some stories, anecdotes of people, places, books I've seen. And then what I'd like to do is question and answer for the next 10 or 15 minutes, because I can go on and on and on and on about old books, and at least with question and answer, I can go on about what you want to listen to. The last minute or two of the talk, I will appraise 1 or 2 books from the audience to the whole audience in detail. After that, I'll end the formal part of the talk, so anyone who wants to go can go. But I'll stay, I'll answer any and all questions, I'll do all the appraisals. I'll just do them much more quickly so we can get out of here tonight. I guess the first thing that comes up when you talk about old books is what is an old book? And usually people mean by that, what's a valuable old book? Well, the first printed book was in 1456, the Gutenberg Bible. And if any of you have a Gutenberg Bible, let me assure you that it's valuable. Matter of fact, last time one really sold, half of it sold for $5.5 million. Single pages sell between $50,000 and $100,000 on average, and some even more. But anything in the 1400s has value. Some more than others, but anything in the 1400s. After that, it depends on what the book is. You can have a book printed in the 1500s that was a relatively dull and an interesting book then, and it's still a relatively dull and an interesting book now, and nobody cares or will pay very much for it. On the other hand, you can have relatively recent books. The first edition of the first Harry Potter book in London, it's not that old, but it will sell for $30,000 or $40,000. So it's what people are looking for. And almost any type of book you can think of. I get loads of people also who come to me and say, I have an old book and I know it's an old book, and the way I know it's old is the pages are all brown and crumbling. Well, I point out that's more lousy paper than it is how old the book is. And matter of fact, I have a book here, a page from a book. It's not terribly fragile. The paper's white, the ink's black. It's one of the first books done with illustrations. It's printed in the 1490s, so this page is a little over 500 years old. And I'll pass this around and you can see it. And you sort of say to yourself, if they could make books like that then, why don't they do it now? Well, there was a big disadvantage to a book like that. First of all, in the 1490s, you had to be quite wealthy to get an education, to learn how to read. You had to be almost nobility to be able to afford to buy a book like that. Nowadays, maybe books aren't quite as well made, but they're at a price that can be distributed in the millions. And the real value of books is the knowledge in the books and the dissemination of that knowledge, and I think it's a very good trade-off. Inevitably, whenever you talk about book collecting, somebody will say, I have a first edition. How much is it worth? And I point out that most books never came out in a second edition, probably never should have come out in a first edition. Nobody wants them, cares about them, or would pay anything whatsoever. A book has to be historically, scientifically, literarily, or for some other reason important that there are a group of collectors out there who want it. And usually when you think of first editions, you think of literature. Dickens, Twain, Faulkner, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and so on. And even within that, there are a lot of things that make a big difference in the price. The condition being one of the most important. The paper dust jacket on a 20th century book can make all the difference in the world. My father had a copy of William Faulkner's second book called Mosquitoes. Absolutely pristine, as if someone took it from the publisher, sealed it away. At the time he had it, he sold it within a week for $750. At the exact same time, another book dealer in New England had the same book, Mosquitoes, Faulkner, first edition, but it didn't have the paper jacket. It had a few tiny little nicks and bumps on it. Nothing terrible. It took them a year to sell it at $40. Because a lot of collecting is prestige. It's being able to say, look what I have. I have the best. I have the most wonderful. Essentially, I have what you don't have, and people who can afford it will pay absolute top price for the very, very best, but might not consider spending anything at all for something even slightly less. Other things that can affect the value, signed by the author. Well, once again, if the author's unknown, unheard of, the fact that it's signed doesn't mean that much. Maybe one of your relatives wrote a book of poetry, had 50 copies, signed it, gave it to family members. Might mean an awful lot to your family, but it doesn't add much to the value. On the other hand, if it's signed by someone famous, that could add lots of value. Maybe Ernest Hemingway, that hundreds, even thousands of dollars to the value. And almost any type of collecting that you get into, there are nuances that can add or subtract to the value, and I use signed books to show that off a little. There are some authors that are almost impossible to get their signature. J.D. Salinger, for instance, wrote Catcher in the Rye. He lived in New Hampshire, was reclusive, didn't appear in public, and other than to a very close personal friend, absolutely would not sign a book. Thus, his signature adds thousands of dollars to the value because you just can't get them. And actually, a little aside, every once in a while somebody will ask me, is there something that someone brought into the store that you saw that you wish you could have bought and had, sort of like the one that got away? And one of the things, one time a man came into the shop, and he was actually a friend of J.D. Salinger's. And Salinger had written him a group of letters, and in one of the letters he was looking back on when he moved into his house and had it built and so on. And one of the fascinating parts about the letters, there was a little paragraph he was talking about, and he said, well, when they were laying the foundation, there was a bunch of high school kids who helped lay the foundation of the house. And he said, as a matter of fact, one of those kids turned out to be quite a good athlete, that kid Carlton Fisk. So Carlton Fisk helped build J.D. Salinger's house. First of all, I think the letter should be in the Baseball Hall of Fame, but I think the people still have it in any case. My father had a copy of F. Scott Fitzgerald's classic, The Great Gatsby. Now, just opposite what I was saying before, it was a first edition. It didn't have the paper dust jacket. It was well worn and read. But when you opened it up, it was inscribed to the greatest living poet, T.S. Eliot, sincerely F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, in addition to that inscription, when T.S. Eliot read the book, he made marginal notes, annotations, comments, crossed things out, added things into just about every page of the book. That book now would be worth $200,000, $300,000, maybe even $400,000 because of the great association. One last story about autographed and signed books. There was an autograph and manuscript dealer in Massachusetts. He was one of the most prominent in the world. But when he was a young boy, he used to collect books by Robert Frost. And he knew Robert Frost. And when he was 13 years old, he went to London. He bought a copy of Frost's first book called A Boy's Will. He paid a lot of money for it at the time. Very complicated, what really is the first edition. In any case, he came back to Boston. A few weeks later, he met with Frost. He was very proud of himself. He said, look what I've got. And Frost looked at it and said, well, what did you pay for it? And he told him. Frost said, give me the book. And he opened it up to the front two end papers and wrote a 2-page description of how to tell the first binding from the second, from the third, from the fourth, how they changed bindings, why they changed bindings, the different colors of the bindings, on and on for 2 pages, signed it, closed the book, handed it back to the boy and said, now it's worth what you paid for it. In any case, let me digress a little, give you a bit of my background in history. The history of the Brattle Bookshop goes back to the 1820s, but for all practical purposes, it was going out of business in 1949. My father was getting married, my mother had $500, and with that they bought half interest in the store. And my father built the business on his love of books, his hard work, his knowledge, and he was also a bit of a character and a showman. And we've had 7 different locations over the years, mainly due to urban renewal. And every time, and it's always been in Boston, that was mentioned. We get calls all the time, and people are in Harvard Square, where are you? We tell them we're downtown. When my father bought the store, there was a little side street in what was Scully Square called Brattle Street. To make it even more confusing, the street doesn't exist anymore. It's where Boston City Hall Plaza is now. And like I say, every time my father would move the store when it was planned, he would move the best books to the new location, then he'd run sales. Half-price dollar, 50-cent, quarter, dime. Last day of the sale, though, everything was free. And he would literally have hundreds of people line up with bags, packs, satchels, whatever, ring a big bell, the people would go charging into the store, grab whatever they could grab. 5 minutes later, he'd ring the bell again, that group would leave, the next group would come in, and he gave away over 250,000 books that way. Now, the last time he did this was in 1969, and we were moving from the end of Washington Street to West Street, where we are now. And at the end of the giveaway, there were books left over. Now, like I say, my father was a bit of a character and a showman, if you can sort of picture this. He hired a covered wagon with a cowboy and a horse team, and on the cover of the covered wagon it said, "Go West, book lovers, go 5 West Street, Brattle Bookshop." They filled it up with books. They drove it from the end of Washington Street near Boston City Hall, up Court Street, down Tremont by the Boston Common to where West Street is, and then back down Washington Street with my father sitting in back, throwing books out the whole way. Now, the superintendent in charge of traffic was a friend of his, told him he could do it all morning, but within an hour, the city was in an absolute standstill. They told him to stop. He didn't care. He'd gotten his point across. And we've been on West Street since then. When we first moved in, we were in a 150-year-old, 5-story wooden building, absolutely crammed full of books. In February of 1980, I got a call at 4 o'clock in the morning, building was on fire, and it literally burnt to the ground. I mean, it was 100% gone. But we wanted to continue, not go out of business, keep the store going. We found a storefront a few doors up the street. We rented folding tables. People either sold, gave us, donated books. Kevin White, who was the mayor at the time, came down with a carload of books. And even though it was a meager stock, within a month we reopened. Over the next 4 years, we slowly but surely rebuilt the stock. 4 years after that, we bought the building we're in now, which is, again, a few doors down on West Street. And it's sort of the old Dickensian type of store. Outside stands at $1, $3 and $5, 2 floors of general used books, and then a 3rd floor with rare books, autographs, manuscripts, first editions, leather bindings, and so on. And that type of business, the large, old, general, secondhand bookstore, especially in the inner cities, is a dying business. It's not dying because people don't like books, buy books, read books, sell books, but particularly in the last 10 or 20 years, property value has gone so high, that rent has gone so high, that old bookstores, which are not the most efficiently run businesses in the world, one right after the other have been going out of business, and in the last couple of years, the internet has just speeded that process along. Now, like I say, we own the property, so I hope to do this for years to come. And I've done this all my life. My parents say my first word was book. I have no idea. Maybe it was. I'm sure they were talking about them. And then I worked after school in elementary school, junior high school, summers during college. I have a degree in chemistry from the University of Massachusetts. I was going to get a doctoral degree at the University of Wisconsin, but in 1973, I needed a year off. My father's health wasn't that good. That year now is over 40 years, and I don't regret for a minute that I'm doing this and not in a laboratory somewhere. If you would ask me what's one item I wish I could find, it's a little pamphlet here called Tamerlane by a Bostonian, done in 1827. It doesn't look like very much, but the Bostonian who did this was Edgar Allan Poe. It's his first book. It's a classic rarity in American literature. Matter of fact, the first copy to ever really be found was in the 1890s on a book dealer's 10-cent table. Another dealer spotted it there, bought a stack of books so it wouldn't stand out. And in 1890, sold it for $1,000. Then in the 1950s, there were 2 postmen who on the side were book scouts. Being postmen, they knew where all the yard sales were. They bought a trunk of books, bottom of the trunk, Tamerlane. Families got involved, they got to negotiating, and after 6 months, they sold it for $10,000. Now, I don't know if it was worth it, because they started out best of friends. By the time they sold it, they never spoke again, but they got their $10,000. And then, about 10 or 12 years ago, an antique dealer in the Newburyport area died. His whole estate was auctioned. Paintings, prints, books. Books as a group, $600 to an antique dealer in New Hampshire. They took all the pamphlets, put them in a box, $15 each. Someone, of course, picked out a Tamerlane, and about 10 years ago sold it for $198,000. And a copy a few years ago sold for $800,000. And let me just say, this is a facsimile. A lot of what I bring with me are originals, but I don't bring million-dollar pamphlets. But if any of you want to take a close look and then go home and check your attic, cellars, basements, whatever, if you find one, please give me a call. I'd love to hear about it. A lot of the fun of collecting is learning about something, is studying it, is appreciating it. I mean, it's really your knowledge that makes something interesting and thus valuable. Someone might look at something and say, oh, that's a scrap of paper. Someone else might say that's a broadside that led to the Boston Tea Party, that led to the American Revolution, that led to our country's independence. So it's really the knowledge, the understanding that makes things interesting. Now here's an item that I think on the surface is interesting, but the story behind it may be even more so. This is on White House stationery. It's dated April 11th, 1933, and it starts, Dear Jim, I want to send you this note to tell you how happy I am that you are to represent the United States in Poland. It's the most important post, et cetera, signed always sincerely Franklin Roosevelt, and it's to the Honorable James Michael Curley, Mayor of Boston. Now, this is an ambassadorial appointment and a great honor. Well, Curley didn't think it was such an honor. Matter of fact, I think he thought Roosevelt was trying to get rid of him, which of course he probably was. And Curley's response to Roosevelt, remember this was 1933, he said, in Poland, with Germany on one side, Russia on the other, you should send your worst Republican enemy to Poland. He said, matter of fact, if you think it's so important, why don't you quit and go there yourself? Now, Curley's response and feelings about Washington didn't change over the years. We also have about 10 letters that he wrote to his wife when he was in Danbury prison. Now, even though these were personal letters, he was still very much the politician. And there was one quote I particularly liked. He had just gotten into prison, and he wrote to his wife, and he said, many of the four-legged creatures in my cell have more honor than the two-legged creatures in Washington. In any case, enough for Curley. And a lot of the things we get aren't just books, but we get paper, ephemera, programs. Here's a program from the 1912 World Series where the Red Sox played the Giants. The Red Sox won the World Series in 1912, won a few more times in up until 18. And by the way, when they won it in 18, they beat the Cubs. And then we had to wait a long time. We'll see what this year brings, maybe. But not only is it interesting as a baseball item, but on the back there's an ad for Arrow shirts and collars. Collars are $2 for $1. Shirts are $1.50 and $2. I think they'll go for a little more nowadays. It's also become very popular to go on cruises and cruise ships. I have a brochure here for a ship that tells you how wonderfully built, where to book passage. And anyone who wants to go on the Titanic, this is a brochure for it. And, you know, almost anything you can think of, there are people out there who are interested. There are whole societies of Titanic historians who do nothing but study the Titanic. And there's also a tendency, whenever you talk about books and book collecting, or any type of collecting for that matter, all of a sudden everything seems to be worth $1,000, $100,000, $1 million. And I like to point out, not everything has to be high priced to be fun. Old Life magazines, for instance. Here's one with Errol Flynn on the cover. Another with Elizabeth Taylor when she was 15 years old. And the large majority sell for $1, $2. I mean, they're very inexpensive. There are lots of them. There are a few exceptions, but they're very cheap. And matter of fact, we used to have a wall at the store by a stairway where we had 100 or so more of the more famous lives. People would stop and stare at that wall, sometimes a half an hour at a time, just lost in thought and memory. They loved them for the covers, the stories, the articles, the photographs. They made wonderful birthday or anniversary presents if you fell in the right dates. And we had a regular customer one day come in, and he bought about 50 Life magazines from World War II, which is not what he normally bought. And I said to him, why are you buying these? He said, well, I want to teach my children about World War II, and he thought a nice way to do it would be to get some of the old Lives, look at a few of the photos, read an article or two, and then discuss it with them. Sounded like a good idea to me. I was a little skeptical. But he came in a couple of weeks later, and I said to him, how's it going with the Lives? He said, fabulously, but not the way I thought. He says the kids don't care about the stories, the articles, the photographs, but they love the ads. And he says, and it turns out by looking at and discussing the ads with them, he could probably teach them more about what the United States was like during World War II than if they had done everything else anyways. And I have other things. I have a cookbook here from the 1700s. Some of the recipes are wonderful. And then you have how to bake eels the common way. I don't know if I want to bake them anyway, but that's beside the point. One of the most interesting parts about the business for me is going out to houses and estates. That's how we get most of our books. It's almost like being Jim Hawkins on Treasure Island every day, never knowing what you're going to see, who, the people, the places, and so on. And I'll relate a few of those stories to you, and then after that maybe see about some questions. I was out of the store. I got back a while ago, and there was a message that a Mrs. Fisher had called and had some books. I called her up, and she said, yes, my father died in Providence. We have 500 art reference books. We want to get the best price we can. We're inviting a number of dealers down to bid on them. Would you be interested? Well, 500 art reference books sounded like a good library. Providence is only an hour from Boston. They lived on an old street called Benefit Street up near Brown University. I got to the house. It was a large old colonial house. I got led through the house into a courtyard, into a garage. Second floor of the garage, they had 5,000 books. Well, it turned out her married name was Fisher, but her father's name was John Nicholas Brown. Family founded Brown University, one of the wealthier families in the country. And after about 6 months, I bought about 80% of the books I wanted, and I was happy, and she was pleased, and she said, my mother has a lot of books. Most are being given to the university, some are being sold at auction, but would you like to take a trip to Newport to take a look at the books there? Well, their house in Newport is one of the mansions on the ocean. I mentioned this to my wife. She decided to come with me on this deal. And one of the fascinating parts about it was being in one of those mansions that was still being lived in by a family. And at one point, wandering from the basement to the attic, all on my own, without a tour guide saying, come here, go here, do this. It was fascinating. Another time I got called to Newport to do an appraisal. Now, when I come to groups like this, I do hundreds of free appraisals. Matter of fact, my goal is that whenever you think of an old book, you think of me in the Brattle Bookshop. I don't care if you think of 10 others, just as long as I'm one of the 10. And one of the ways I feel I can do that is by giving out as much free information as reasonably possible. But there are times when people need very formal written appraisal for insurance, estate taxes, then I discuss a fee. In any case, Newport, another mansion, not quite as big as the Browns. This was the Perry family. Commodore Perry, Oliver Hazard Perry. And what they had was a whole stack of papers from the War of 1812. During the war, their family were privateers. Well, they're privateers if you're on our side. They're pirates if you're on the other side. It's all the way you look at it. But it was the day-to-day accountings of the ships, and they were fascinating to read through. They would sometimes capture a ship and realize tens of thousands of dollars profit. In 1812, that was an incredible amount of money. Then one day, one of the ships got into a battle. The ship got hit. The captain got hit. He lost his leg. About 3 days later, at the bottom of the page, there was an entry. Captain, $5 bonus, loss of leg. And that was the last you heard of the captain. So a little different nowadays, too. When my father was still alive, and he died over 30 years ago, we got a call from a lady. She was very vague about her name, what she had or so on, but it sounded like she might have a few interesting things, and she lived relatively close by. We got to her house. It was a little ranch house. Paint was peeling, weeds were growing, and you sort of say to yourself, oh, gee, what's going to be here? She answered the door. She was quite elderly, and we walk in, and there were just gorgeous antiques everywhere. I mean, really, really beautiful antiques. And she got to talking. It turned out she was originally from the Boston area, but she had married the Prince of the Ukraine, the cousin of the Tsar of Russia. He had escaped just before the revolution. And she told story after story about being Russian nobility in Europe and all the court intrigues and all the goings-on, how T.E. Shaw used to stay at their house all the time, how she didn't think he accidentally died on a motorcycle, but there was a lot more to it. T.E. Shaw, of course, was Lawrence of Arabia. And she went on and on and on with these wonderful stories. Turned out her books were lousy, but the stories were absolutely wonderful. And when we first got into the house, on one of her walls, she had 10 watercolors. They were nice pastoral European scenes. When I first saw them, I thought they were nice. And the more she talked and the longer we were there and the more I looked at them, the nicer I thought they were. And I finally said to her, you know, those 10 watercolors, they're really nice. And she turned around and said, oh, yes, they're all Turners. So she had 10 original Turner watercolors, probably $1 million worth of painting. And it was like, oh, yes, they're all Turners. So you never know what you're going to see, the people, the places, the characters. And matter of fact, speaking of characters, about 15 years ago, we went to one of our customers' 100th birthday parties. Now, when you go to a man's 100th birthday party, and he tells you he just got back from Barcelona, he's going to give a talk in Florida, and he's been asked to lecture in Tokyo. And I finally said to him, wait a minute, you're 100 years old. Don't you think Tokyo is an awfully long way to go? And he said, well, when I used to work, it took me well over 25 hours to get to Chicago. He says, I don't think Tokyo's a whole lot further than that nowadays. And here's a man who can also tell you about one day sitting down to dinner with Henry Ford and Thomas Edison. He was a young man at the time, and he was really looking forward to this dinner and all the learning and insight he was going to get from these two men. He said he was excited enough. He got there a little bit early, sat down. 5 minutes later, Ford came in and sat down next to him. And about 15 minutes later, Edison came in. Now, Edison was elderly, had one of those big horns for hearing, sat down opposite, and he said the first thing, Ford turned to Edison and yelled, "My Tom, you look very good." And Edison turned to Ford and yelled, "It's the Carter's little liver pills." This man said all night long, all they did was yell about Carter's little liver pills. And he said next time he wanted to learn something, he went to the library. Now, I can go on and on and on with these stories. I'll tell one more, and then we'll see about some questions. We get hundreds of phone calls at the store. Do you have a book? Can you get a book? How hard is it to get the book? Does the book exist? Or what's the value? How much is it worth? And so on. And most of those questions, either I or the people I work with, we can answer right off the top of our heads. Some are a little more involved, and every once in a while you really have to do some research, but that can be fun too. But you get a call every once in a while that really stands out. And again, this was a while ago, but I answered the phone, "Hello, Brattle Bookshop, can I help you?" Lady, very elderly, thick Irish brogue, and the first thing she says is, "President Kennedy slept with me." Now, you have to admit that gets your attention. She stops and waits for it to sink in, and then she went on to explain that she had worked for the Kennedy family. She had been his nursemaid. When he was 3 and 4 years old, he used to fall asleep in her arms. So he did sleep with her, but maybe not what you first think. And what she had was a whole series of handwritten letters from the president. Now, presidential letters of any type have value. Handwritten letters from later 20th century presidents are very hard to get, very scarce, and very valuable. She wanted to get an offer on them. I was actually skeptical about that, but I thought she'd be fun to meet. I went to her house. The letters were fabulous. I gave her what I thought was a tremendous offer on them, but much as I suspected, there was no way she could sell these letters. The letters were part of her life. As far as I know, they're still with her family. I left a note behind. Maybe someday I'll hear about them again, but they're probably where they belong. Like I say, I can go on and on and on, but why don't I see if there are some questions, because quite honestly, anything you ask me, I can go off on a tangent. In any case, do you want me to just repeat it? Do you want to mic the... There's a gentleman right up there. Right up there.
All right.
Thank you. So I collect old bird books, particularly bird guides, but I was curious if what are some of the cool bird guides you've seen, and B, is there anything around that is potentially interesting or valuable? Obviously, things within reason, not like Audubon's craziness or anything like that, but.
Well, the question is, you collect bird guides, and are there things around, and are they collectible? Well, one of the first things that comes to mind when people mention bird guides, people don't use them anymore. Quite honestly, the internet with iPhones and all of that, you can just, or a good camera can be hooked up. So the actual sale nowadays of any type of guide of that type, or anything pure information, has dropped off tremendously because people do that all electronically. But on the other hand, that can make bird guides really interesting to collect because they tend to be around, they're not terribly expensive, there isn't as huge an interest as there was, so they're cheap. And one of the great things about bird guides is, one of the fun parts about collecting is the hunt. It's being able to, every antique bookstore, every auction you go to, every library sale, every book sale, every antique store might have a guide. So you always have some place to go. There are some that, the first edition, the very first Peterson guide, especially if it's signed, can run into the hundreds of dollars. But then you can try to collect every edition of the Peterson's guides and see how they sold. And that in and of itself can be a huge collection. So, and then there are other types of guides that have been put out. I was going to say, yes, they can get expensive with Audubon. In a sense, that's a bird guide. If you have a few extra millions of dollars, you can buy the original. And then there are a lot of other people who put them out. Chapman put out a really good guide. There are other, and it depends. Some of them are much more scientific than others. Some are literally just identification. Nowadays, with the electronics, not only do you get that, but you can get the sound. You can get the, and one of the greatest collections in the world on that is Cornell. They have one of, so I mean, I could go on and on, but that's, and it's a great collection because you can find things at very little money, and you can collect a lot, and there's loads out there. And the last thing you ever want to do when you're collecting is collect something that you can't get, because that's not any fun either. I guess the woman.
I've become the latest member of our town's historical society, and I'm younger by the average member by about 30 years. And we have an old schoolhouse. I'm trying to sort through bunches of papers and such like this. What is the best way, or what are some of the best ways to keep the quality of letters and old documents and stuff like that? The previous person put a lot of things into, plastic sheets and into notebooks. So, you can look at it without getting your paws on it. And there's no climate control, there's nothing like that. I mean, are we asking for trouble here, or is it going to be?
Well, the question is, how do you take care of, and so on. I'm sure even the man who handed you the mic could answer that a lot better too. But a couple of things on that. First of all, it's a budget. Part of it's just budgetary. One of the things that, without climate control, a lot of these things have lasted a long time. They will last a long time, as long as they're not abused. If they're in these plastic acetate and they're acid-free, now one of the things you want to be real careful with that plastic is that it doesn't have that piece of black paper in it and still in it. If it is, get rid of that black paper. That would be the first thing. The other thing that I would advise, depending on how many volunteers and how many people you have, is to try to digitize, either scan, take a photo or whatever, and that way anyone who actually has to really work with the papers, for the most part, doesn't have to touch them anymore. Then I would consult places, maybe like the New Hampshire Historical Society, and see, ask them, how do other historical societies take care of things? Ask people who've had a career of doing this what they would advise. And and it also depends on how valuable. I mean, if you say your historical society has letters from George Washington to Belknap, or to, great leaders and so on that are worth huge amounts of money, or an original printing of the Declaration of Independence, that's a whole different thing than the family who's been in the town since it was started and so on. And again, I would just call the advice of a major library, talk to them about what you have, maybe what it makes sense is, if it's a tremendous collection, is to have it housed and really become part of the major library with copies available. But that's all depends on what it is. And you can ask a lot of times as far as value, if you ask people. One of the things is, if you ask a person who loves what they do a question, usually the problem isn't getting an answer, it's getting them to stop answering. if you don't ask, you're not going to get the answer. What's the worst a person can say is no? So that's what I would suggest, because then it gets into the real details of exactly what you have, what's the condition, what kind of paper, how bad is the atmosphere in the place that they're being stored, and same with books and so on. So that's at least a start.
The New Hampshire Historical Society now and then does programs in conjunction with New England Document Conservation Center, and they actually give people advice on how to care for their stuff.
Yeah.
Big problem in this part of this part of the country is mold. I mean, it is a serious issue. But yeah, call the Historical Society in Concord.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, and they do have a digitizing software so you can.
Yeah, and that I advise an awful lot of try to get things copied in a good copy so that if people come in, they can use it, they can research it, they can do it, but they're not every single person handling it. And that's happening more and more. I think the lady right here.
Hi, I'm librarian at our local historical society, and we have books like this that come in, and they come in boxes, or people will drop off boxes filled with documents. Sometimes we can get to them, sometimes we can't. And trying to put value or precedence on some of these things can be very, very difficult. And what would you advise? And I'd also like you to take a peek at this book later.
Well, I'll look at all of the books and so on at the end, and I'll do it fairly quickly. As far as appraisal, one of the things that's very helpful with appraisal, at least when people ask me about it, is if you have some idea of what you have. I mean, when I do Antiques Roadshow, someone will come in with a folder this big stacked with letters, and you go, well, what are they about? Well, oh, we don't know. You have to read it. I mean, that's fine and good if you've got a half a minute, But so what I a lot of times will advise historical side people is if you can somehow make a 1, maybe 2-page summary of who it is, what it is, why it might be important, that can go an awfully long way for an appraiser to say, well, yeah, this sounds like something that could be valuable. After that, in a lot of the papers that are local, maybe town-related, aren't worth a lot of money, but they're very valuable to the historian. But if you went and said, okay, Christie's, I want you to auction this, they'll go, but nobody's going to pay for it. And actually, the biggest buyer for that type of thing would be your historical society, and I'm willing to bet you don't have a lot of money. So, but you can ask and advise, and then there are people who will do the appraisals, and a lot of times an appraiser, if they can get a sense of what you have, can give you an estimate. I mean, a lot of times I'll give a verbal estimate of what ballpark I think the material might be and what I would charge to do it. And verbally, I'll do it for free, as long as it's quick. Once, though, I have to write my name down and do it formally, then it gets expensive. Because then you got to be it's a lot different story. So.
One other thing is family Bibles.
Well, family Bibles, I'll actually talk about Bibles a little at the end. I actually talk about that to a degree, but let's save that for an end. It's a story I tell right at the end, but yeah, they show up a lot. Was there, right here?
Oh, well.
Yes.
We have a goodly number of books at home. Is there some good place to check, I assume on the web, general values of books by title or that, so that we know if it's worth pursuing an actual appraisal?
Well, the question is, are there resources or references that you can easily go to, either on the web or something, to get an idea how valuable the books are? That's really tricky. The way I tell that, and I'll go into it a little more, is the web or that type of thing is a tool. Now, you give a cabinet maker a really good set of tools and and they can build a beautiful cabinet. I might end up bashing my thumb with the hammer. It's the same tool, I don't know how to use it well. And it's the same thing with the web. There's tremendous amounts of information out there. One of the problems is most of it's not edited, and there's tremendous amounts of information. So, you know, a lot of times you can look and you'll say, gee, the same book seems to be there for $5 and $5,000. Might be the same book. Maybe the person putting it up there have no idea what they're doing. Maybe there's a reason, maybe there isn't. One of the things that I always tell people, though, if you look things up on the web, and there's ABE books, there's Bookfinder, you can always get in touch, and there are many, many others. But one of the things I always tell people, before you even start looking at the price, if you look up a book on the web on one of these sites, and you start seeing a lot of copies, 20, 40, 50, 100 copies, well, that means there's 20, 40, 50, 100 copies that haven't sold, regardless what the price is. So that's one thing to look at. One of the things my wife said, if you're a dealer or you're trying to sell books on the web, there are 3 requirements to actually sell the book. 1, you have to have the only copy. 2, you have to have the best copy. 3, you have to have the cheapest. You have to have one of those 3 if you actually expect to sell it. And normally, the cheapest is what really sells it. Because, you know, people say, well, they're priced from this price to that price, but, well, it should be in the middle. But if you're buying it, are you going to buy the one that's in the middle, or are you going to buy the one that seems to be the same and the cheapest? That's one thing to do. The other thing that I suggest to people very strongly is you can come to somebody like myself or a good book dealer in the area, and if you have a quick list or something like that, usually I can go through that list and I can say, look, don't worry about this, but if you want to double check, check this one, check that, and I can maybe get your list from 100 to 2 or 3. The other thing is I see someone there with a box of books. What I tell people now is line them up on a shelf. If I can see the spines, take one digital picture. You can sometimes get 2 shelves, and I can look at that picture and I can tell you, wow, this is a collection that really needs to be looked at. Or, yeah, they're all nice books, but whatever. Or the 3rd book from the right on the 2nd shelf down, I need more information. And that's a really quick, fast way to get a sense of things. You know, and I could go on and on. Anyone? I'll tell you what, why don't I get one more question over here, and then I'll get into appraising.
I was given a bag of Joseph Lincoln novels that were wormy. And I thought bookworms were a joke, but these had worms, and I put them in the shed. But will that go away? Will they die? Should I ever bring them in the house, or should I burn them up? Or
Well, my advice on Joe Lincoln books would be just buy better copies and get rid of those. Joe Lincoln was a writer who wrote on Cape Cod for the most part. I think if you go to book sales on Cape Cod, I think it would be almost impossible to find one that doesn't have a shelf of Joe Lincoln books. And also because a lot of them are on Cape Cod that's damp, that's a problem. But one of the things, when you start dealing with books that get a little bit moldy, damp, insects, whatever, part of the reason is that they're in a moldy, damp, insect-infested place. And if you're dealing with just day-to-day books, the only thing you can really do is get them out of that location. Now, if you're dealing with very rare, very valuable, very high-priced items, then there are places like the New England Conservative, and they can do almost anything. They're just going to charge you a lot of money. And if you have a Joe Lincoln book that might be worth $1, you don't want to spend hundreds of dollars repairing it. Usually, if you get the books out of the damp area, they can dry out. If it's a book, now the conservator would die if you, what I'm going to say, but if you think you have a few little bugs and you want to keep those books and they're not valuable, put them in a garbage bag, spray it full of Raid. You won't have any bugs when you get them back out. But I guarantee you, if you have valuable books, you won't have valuable books when you get done with that either. But, again, if it's just a practical thing. But With insects or mold, you do not want to keep them in the house, and you don't want to put them next to books that are in good shape, because the mold will grow, the insects will move, and quite honestly, if you have insects in the books, you've got other problems too. I mean, in any case. Tell you what, at this point, why don't I do one or two appraisals that I'll do to the whole audience in detail. Did anyone bring a Bible? No? Yes? If you want, I'll do that. And did anyone bring a Victorian-style cloth book that has a beautiful decorative cover? Nice cloth, decorative, beautiful. And the reason I'm asking for these, and if nobody did, I just happened to bring one. The reason I'm asking for these has almost nothing to do with value, but they lead into stories. No cloth Victorian book with a decorative cover. No, that one, is that leather? Yeah, no. No, I don't want leather, I want cloth. No, it has nothing to do with the book. That's perfect. And like I say, the reason I'm asking for these has almost nothing to do with value. But first of all, let me say one thing about when I do appraisals at groups like this. When I give a price, I generally give a retail price. In other words, that price that you would pay if you came into my store or a store like mine. It is not what you would get if you're selling the book. Usually you should expect about 1/3 to 2/3 of the retail value. When you get to the very low end, the markup might even be higher because you just have to make some money. And when you get to the much higher prices, the percentages can come down. A number of years ago, I had a copy of Audubon's Quadrupeds, not the birds, but the animals, big, huge, 155 hand-colored plates. At the time, I paid $100,000 for it. I sold it within a week for $105,000. That's only a 5% markup, but it's $5,000. Well worth the time and effort I spent, and I pretty much had it pre-sold before I even bought it. So when you get to the much higher values, especially when something will turn over quickly, percentages can come down just because there's more money involved. Also, everything I say is subjective. In other words, the fact that I say a book is worth $100 doesn't mean a colleague of mine say $125 and another colleague say $75. If you know what you have, you go to somebody, you get a price and you're happy, great. But if you're not sure, get a second, third, fourth, fifth opinion. There's nothing wrong with that. It's more a matter of how much time and effort you want to spend. In any case, the first book I have here is called Rock of Ages. It's 1879, printed in Boston. It has some nice black and white illustrations in it. It's what's called a gift book, really. If you go into a Hallmark card shop nowadays, and they have those little books of poetry, or maybe some of them are a little religious, some of them aren't, and they have nice pictures, and they're a few dollars. Go back 100, 20, 30, 40 years, this is the equivalent, and people bought them. This is nice. It's not a major work. $10, $20 at most is what. It's in good shape. A lot of times the edges get banged, but $10, $20. But one of the reasons I wanted to ask for a book like this is before they widely had dust jackets. Now, dust jackets go way back, but as we know dust jackets, it's around World War I. But before that, a lot of the publishers would put out books with very decorative cloth bindings. And one of the reasons they do that was they figured if you walked into a bookstore and the book caught your eye, more chance that you'd buy it. And matter of fact, I'm going to pass this one back up just so it doesn't get lost in the... but there are people who collect books like this just for the cloth binding. So, people collect almost anything. And individually, they might not seem like much, and you can go to every yard sale, book sale, library sale, et cetera, and a lot of these are very, very cheap. Now, some are very expensive, but you can pick up loads of them. And individually, they might not seem like much, but graphically, they can make quite a collection. As a matter of fact, I have a collection like this myself that started off as a bit of a joke. One day I got a book and had a picture of a toilet on the cover. The title of the book was Flushed with Pride, The Life of Thomas Crapper. Went to the toilet. Anyways, I got it, I brought it home, I showed it to my wife. She took one look at it and said, we have to put this in the bathroom. So we did. A couple of days later, I got another book and had a big eye staring out of the cover. Title was We Never Sleep. It was a history of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. But with a big eye staring at you, I thought, put that in the bathroom too. Now this is a little half bathroom, so there's no shower, no steam. Next thing you know, we built bookshelves, and now we have 300 or 400 of these Victorian-style cloth illustrated books in our bathroom. People walk in, there's loads of reading material. They're a little taken aback. And one of the rules of the collection is that nothing can be valuable, because of course every once in a while a book falls off the shelf, and you can imagine where it ends up. I like to end the talk talking about Bibles, and one of the reasons I like to do that is the Bible is the most commonly printed book of all time, always has been, always will be. And we sometimes get 5 and 10 calls a week where people have 100, 200-year-old family Bibles, and in almost all of the cases we have to say, if this is your family Bible, it's been handed down through the generations, sentimentally it's priceless. Monetarily, it might not be worth that much, but sentiment. And there are exceptions, so it's always worth checking. There's the Gutenberg Bible, there's loads of others, so it's worth checking. And also those big family Bibles from the later 1800s and so on, with the beautifully embossed covers and clasps, they can sell for $100 to $300 if they're in mint condition, because they make wonderful gifts for ministers, priests, divinity students. But break one clasp, have one hinge go, they lose all that value. Now sometimes, this might be a little to what you were asking, in the beginning, middle, or end of those Bibles, there's a family genealogy. Those can be invaluable to the local historical or genealogical society, but in many cases, all they want to do is Xerox out that page, maybe the title page, but they don't want the big, huge Bible. So in any case, and one of the things that mentioned in the introduction was that I do Antiques Roadshow, and I hope that people watch it. It's a lot of fun to do, great way to see the country. What people don't realize is they don't pay anything. They don't pay flying, hotel, but it's a lot of fun, really enjoy it, get good PR. And the way that show works is you do it at a convention center, and from about 7:30 in the morning to 8 or 8:30 at night, pretty much nonstop. There are folding tables in a circle. There are 3 book appraisers next to the music appraisers, next to the jewelry appraisers, next to the ceramic, all around in a big circle. And there's about 5,000 people who come to a show. Each person has 2 items, so there's about 10,000 items appraised. They tape around 50, 60 items, which makes up 3 hours of television. And of course, being an appraiser, you actually have to be there before 7:30. And I remember one of the cities we were in, and we were talking among the appraisers, the other book appraisers, and we were saying, how many Bibles do you think we'll see today? And we counted 75 in one day in one city. Now this is a complete analysis, Holy Bible, 1860s, and it's sort of your typical Bible with analysis. It actually has a very nice leather binding, and it's in good shape, and it would probably sell in the $50 to $100 range because it's just a beautiful, well-done Bible. But it's not anything rare, special, unusual. And I'm going to just leave it here so we don't do it. And one last story to end the talk about Bibles, and then we'll see about the thing. I got called a number of years ago to a large old church in Boston. The church was well over 100 years old. And they wanted me there just to see, they had a huge library, just to see if over the years they had accumulated any valuable books. Well, actually, it turned out it was a lot of fun. They had some very nice books. At the end of the day, the priest said to me, could you come down the basement? There were a few more books. So I went down there and looked at it. And then there was a closet. It would probably like, if you had a closet there and just a small room, and the priest opened the door, front to back, floor to ceiling, top to bottom. It was stuffed with thousands of old Bibles. And I looked at the priest and I said, what is this? He says, well, people hate to throw away a book. They feel it's sacrilegious to throw away a Bible. So what happens when a parishioner dies and the family doesn't want the Bible? They come and they present it to the church. He says, and what do? We very graciously accept it because we don't want to offend anybody. Then we go down the basement, open the door, throw it in with the rest of them. And he says, and we can't drive a dumpster up to the back of the church and fill it full of Bibles. That just wouldn't be right. And I use it as an example to say that if you want to give something to a charity, ask them if they want it first. If they want it and can use it, it's great. But if all you're doing is taking your old stuff, and you're really not doing anyone a favor. Now, like I say, I'm not bashful about it. I have a card here. We have 800 numbers, websites, so on and so forth. Don't ever feel that you're bothering myself, the people I work with. We'd rather have 100 people call with nothing special than to have 100 first person say, I just threw away a Tamerlane. Now, the way I do the appraisals is more in a crowd seat. I'll end the formal part of the talk, but it's just sort of crowd around, get in line. If anyone wants, I'm not going to do it formally because it takes too long. If anyone wants to stand over my shoulder, hear what I'm saying, great. If anyone has a lot of books and there's a line, I'll do one or two of them and then tell you to go to the end of the line. I'll do them all, but it's not fair to keep people waiting. And if there's like a whole box of books, what you might do is even take them out, lay them spine up, and then at the end, I'll take a quick look. But I'll say basically, thank you very much, and thank you, and just bring things.